You are on HOA meltdown moments. The tow hook was inches away. Karen yelled that the board had to vote again, and until they did, I was in violation every day. She stood at the edge of my driveway with her arms crossed, a stack of printed photos of my fence materials in one hand, her voice climbing loud enough that the couple on the porch 2 houses down stopped their conversation to watch. "If you touch that, I add another violation," she said, and I could feel my jaw tighten because I had not even picked up the sample board yet. I work as a logistics coordinator, and I run on deadlines. The idea of standing in my own yard being lectured about a fence I had not even built yet made my blood pressure spike. But I kept my voice level. I said I had submitted everything weeks ago and followed every instruction in the packet. She smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes, and said, "You can be mad, or you can be compliant." Then she turned and walked back toward her car, the photos still in her hand like some kind of trophy. I live in Bangor, Maine, in a neighborhood called Autumn Ridge Estates Association, and every backyard upgrade becomes a committee argument. I had moved here about 2 years earlier because the house was affordable and close to work, and I had not paid much attention to the HOA rules beyond the basics. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was thinking that submitting paperwork early would protect me. My elderly parent had moved in with me about 6 months ago, and the stress of managing their health on top of everything else was already wearing me down. The fence was supposed to be simple. Privacy, a little shade, a place where my parent could sit outside without feeling like the whole block was watching. I had picked a standard 6-foot cedar design, filled out the architectural review form, attached photos of the style and stain color, and mailed it in. I got an approval letter 3 weeks later. I thought I was done. Ann Turner, the vendor coordinator for the HOA, had other plans. She lived 4 streets over in a house with a manicured lawn and a mailbox that looked like it had been power washed every weekend. She had been on the board for about 5 years, and her role was officially to manage contractor relationships and approve vendor access. Unofficially, she ran a community safety committee like a private police force with no authority, and she treated every rule like a personal mission. I did not know any of this when I hired a local contractor to start the fence work. I just knew I had approval, I had a quote, and I had a start date. The contractor showed up on a Monday morning with 2 crew members and a truck full of materials. They had barely started marking the fence line with string when Ann pulled up in her sedan. She got out holding a clipboard and a steaming coffee cup in a gloved hand, and she walked straight over to the contractor like she owned the place. I was inside grabbing my backpack when I heard her voice rise. I stepped outside and saw her pointing at the sample board the contractor had propped against the fence. She was saying something about color approval and material grade, and the contractor was shaking his head, trying to explain that everything matched the submission. Ann turned to me and said the board had never approved this exact stain, and the wood grade was commercial when it should have been residential. I pulled out my approval letter and showed her the attached photos. She glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds and said the photos were not clear enough and the board would need to re-vote. I asked when that vote had happened in the first place, and she said it did not matter, because the current interpretation was what counted now. I swallowed my anger because I knew the moment to use it was coming. I told the contractor to hold off for the day while I sorted it out, and Ann left with a satisfied look on her face. I went inside and pulled up the email thread with the management company. I had every submission, every confirmation, every approval documented with timestamps. The approval letter had been signed by the board president, and the photos had been attached as high-resolution files. I forwarded the entire chain to the management company and asked for clarification on the revote Ann had mentioned. The response came back that afternoon. The management company confirmed the approval was valid and no revote was needed. They said Ann had been misinformed and they would reach out to her directly. I felt a small spark of relief, but it did not last long. The next morning, Anne showed up again. This time she had a tape measure and a clipboard with a printed site plan. She told the contractor he was violating the setback and the fence line was 6 inches too close to the property boundary. The contractor pulled out his own measuring tape and showed her the marks matched the survey stakes from the original plot plan. Anne said the survey stakes were wrong and the HOA had its own interpretation of the easement line. I stepped outside and asked to see the HOA site plan. She held it up, but she kept it angled away from me so I could not read the fine print. She said the setback was supposed to be 18 inches, not 12, and the fence would have to move or I would be in violation starting immediately. The contractor looked at me and said he was not moving anything without a written order from the board or a licensed surveyor, and Anne said that was fine because she would have the truck towed if it was still here in an hour. That was the moment I realized this was not about the fence. This was personal, and she wanted to make an example of me. I called the management company again and explained the setback threat. They put me on hold for 10 minutes, then came back and said the standard setback in the covenants was 12 inches unless a specific variance applied, and there was no variance on file for my lot. They said they would send Anne an email, but they could not stop her from calling a tow company if she claimed the truck was blocking access. I asked if the truck was blocking access, and the contractor said no, it was parked in my driveway. The management company said they could not get involved in a towing dispute and I should contact local police if I felt the tow was unlawful. I hung up and looked at the contractor. He said his crew was ready to walk if this turned into a circus, and I did not blame him. Anne was standing near the property line, arms crossed, watching us like she was waiting for me to make a move. I made a decision. I told the contractor to pack up for the day and I would pay him for his time. I said I was going to hire a licensed surveyor to mark the exact boundary and easement lines, and once I had that documentation, we would resume. The contractor said that was smart and he would hold the materials for 2 weeks. Anne overheard and said a survey would not change the HOA interpretation. And I said we would see about that. She walked back to her car and drove off, and I stood there in the driveway with my phone in my hand, trying to figure out my next move. My parent was inside watching through the window, and I could see the worry on their face. The whole situation was adding stress I could not afford, but I was not going to roll over for someone who thought the rules were whatever she said they were on any given day. I called a local surveyor that afternoon and explained the situation. He said he could come out within 3 days and provide a stamped boundary survey that would show the legal property lines, easements, and any encroachments. The cost was $800, which I had not budgeted for, but I did not see another option. I scheduled it and sent a courtesy email to the management company and the board letting them know a licensed survey was being conducted and I expected the results to resolve the setback question. I copied Anne on the email. She replied within an hour. She said the survey was unnecessary and the board had already determined the setback based on the original plat, and if I proceeded with the fence in the current location, I would be cited for a violation and fined $50 per day until it was corrected. I stared at that email for a long time. $50 per day. I had not even started building yet, and she was already threatening daily fines. I forwarded the email to a real estate attorney I had used during the home purchase and asked for a consultation. He called me back the next day and said the HOA could impose fines for violations, but the violation had to be legitimate and documented, and any fine schedule had to follow the process outlined in the covenants. He said if the survey proved I was within the legal setback, the HOA would have no grounds to fine me, and if they tried anyway, I could challenge it in a hearing or file a complaint with the management company. He also said that if Anne was making threats outside her authority, that could be a problem for the board and I should document everything. I told him about the contractor intimidation and the towing threat and he said that crossed a line. He suggested I keep a log of every interaction, save every email, and consider filing a formal complaint with the management company if the harassment continued. I thanked him and hung up, and I started a spreadsheet. Every date, every conversation, every email, every photo. I was going to build a paper trail so thick she could not wiggle out of it. The surveyor came out on Thursday. He spent about 3 hours walking the property line, setting up his equipment, and taking measurements. He found the original survey stakes and confirmed they were accurate. He also measured the easement and the setback, and he told me the legal setback from the property line was 12 inches, not 18. He said the easement did not extend into the buildable area where I planned the fence, and there was no encroachment. He gave me a stamped document with a site map and measurements, and he said if anyone questioned it, they could contact him directly, and he would stand by the results. I thanked him and immediately scanned the document and emailed it to the management company, the board president, and Anne. I included a note that said the survey confirmed the fence location was compliant and I would be resuming work the following week. I felt a surge of confidence. I had proof. I had a licensed professional backing me up. I thought that would be the end of it. Anne replied within 2 hours. She said the survey was incomplete because it did not account for the HOA's recorded plat amendment from 2018, and the amendment redefined the easement boundaries for drainage and utility access. She said the amendment was on file with the county and the board had relied on it for all setback determinations since then. She attached a PDF of a document that looked official, but when I opened it, I could barely read the text because it was a low-resolution scan of a photocopy. I forwarded it to the surveyor and asked if he was aware of any amendments. He called me that evening and said he had pulled the county records and there was no recorded plat amendment for Autumn Ridge Estates in 2018. He said the document Anne sent looked like an internal HOA memo, not a legal plat amendment, and it had no bearing on the actual property boundaries. He said if the HOA wanted to claim an amended easement, they would need to provide a recorded document with a legal description and a county stamp. I forwarded his response to the management company and asked them to verify whether the 2018 amendment existed. They said they would investigate and get back to me. I did not hear anything for 3 days. In the meantime, I rescheduled the contractor to start the following Monday. I figured I had done everything I could to prove compliance, and if the HOA wanted to escalate, they would have to do it through official channels. I was wrong. On Sunday afternoon, I got a certified letter delivered to my door. It was a formal notice of violation from the Autumn Ridge Estates Association Board of Directors. It said I was in violation of Article 7, Section 4, Subsection C of the Covenants for failure to obtain proper architectural approval for exterior modifications, and I was being fined $50 per day retroactive to the date the contractor first arrived on site. The letter said I had 10 days to appeal the violation at a board hearing, and if I did not appeal, or if the appeal was denied, the fines would continue to accrue and could result in a lien on the property. I read it twice, and I felt my hands start to shake. The letter was dated 3 days earlier, which meant they had issued it before the management company even responded to my survey question. It was a coordinated move, and it was designed to bury me in fines before I could fight back. I called the attorney. He read the letter over the phone and said the retroactive fines were aggressive and potentially unenforceable, but the hearing was my chance to challenge the violation and stop the fines from continuing. He said I needed to show up with all my documentation, including the approval letter, the survey, the email thread with the management company, and any proof that the 2018 amendment did not exist. He also said I should be prepared for the board to argue that the approval was conditional or that I had failed to meet some technical requirement, and I needed to have a response ready for every possible angle. He said if the board ruled against me at the hearing, I could appeal to the full membership or file a lawsuit, but litigation was expensive and slow, and the fines would keep accruing in the meantime. He recommended I try to resolve it at the hearing if possible, but he also said I should assume Anne would do everything in her power to make sure I lost. I spent the next week preparing. I printed every email, every letter, every approval document, every survey page. I made a timeline of events with dates and notes. I called the contractor and asked him to write a statement confirming the materials matched the approved plans and the setback was measured correctly. He agreed and sent me a signed letter the next day. I also reached out to the couple on the porch who had been watching the day Anne threatened the towing. They lived 2 houses down, and I had seen them outside a few times but never really talked to them. I knocked on their door and explained what was happening, and I asked if they would be willing to write a statement about what they had seen. The wife said she remembered Anne yelling and waving papers around, and she thought it looked excessive. She said she would write something up, and her husband said he would too. I thanked them and left, and for the first time in days, I felt like maybe I was not completely alone in this. If you are enjoying this, please hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA stories. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 in the evening in the community center meeting room. I showed up at 6:45 with a folder full of documents and my backpack slung over one shoulder. The room was set up with a long table at the front for the board members and rows of folding chairs for residents. There were about 15 people scattered around the room, most of them board members or their friends. Anne was already seated at the front table, wearing her blue blazer and holding a stack of printed photos like she was ready for a trial. The board president, a man in his 60s named Ed, sat in the center. 2 other board members flanked him, and the HOA attorney sat off to the side with a laptop. I took a seat in the front row and waited. My parent had stayed home, and I was glad. I did not want them to see me get railroaded. Ed called the meeting to order and went through some standard agenda items, approving the minutes from the last meeting and discussing a landscaping contract. Then he moved to new business and called my name. He said the board had received my appeal of the violation notice, and they were prepared to hear my case. He asked me to come forward and present my argument, and he said I would have 10 minutes. I stood up and walked to the front, and I could feel every eye in the room on me. I laid out my folder on the podium and started talking. I explained that I had submitted a complete architectural review application, received written approval, hired a licensed contractor, and followed every instruction in the approval letter. I showed them the approval letter with the board president's signature. I showed them the survey proving the setback was compliant. I showed them the email chain with the management company confirming there was no revote required and no recorded plat amendment from 2018. I said the violation notice was based on a reinterpretation of the rules that had not been documented or communicated, and the retroactive fines were punitive and unenforceable. I kept my voice calm and stuck to the facts, and when I finished, I looked at Ed and said I was requesting the violation be dismissed and the fines be waived. Ed thanked me and asked if Anne wanted to respond. She stood up and walked to the podium, and she did not look at me. She said the approval letter I had shown was for a general fence design, not for the specific materials and stain color I had used. She said the board had the right to require reapproval if the final product did not match the original submission, and in her professional opinion, the materials did not match. She said the survey I had provided was irrelevant because the HOA had its own standards for setbacks, and those standards were based on the 2018 amendment she had referenced. She said the amendment was an internal policy document that clarified the board's interpretation of the covenants, and it did not need to be recorded with the county to be enforceable. She said the fines were appropriate and the violation would stand unless I agreed to move the fence to the 18-inch setback and resubmit for approval with corrected materials. She sat down and folded her hands on the table, and I could see she thought she had won. I raised my hand and Ed nodded at me. I said I had one more piece of evidence I wanted to present. I pulled out my phone and opened a voice memo app. I said I had recorded a conversation with Anne about a week earlier, and I wanted the board to hear it. Anne's face went pale. I hit play, and the room went silent. The recording was from a phone call Anne had made to me 3 days after the surveyor finished. In the recording, she said she did not care what the survey showed because the board would back her interpretation no matter what, and she admitted she was pushing the issue because she wanted to make an example of me so other homeowners would not challenge the board in the future. She said it was personal and she was tired of people thinking they could do whatever they wanted just because they had paperwork. The recording ended, and I looked at Ed. I said that was evidence that the violation was not about compliance. It was about retaliation and intimidation, and the board had a responsibility to address it. The room erupted. 2 of the board members started talking over each other, and the HOA attorney leaned forward and said something to Ed I could not hear. Anne stood up and said the recording was taken without her consent and it was inadmissible, and I said Maine is a one-party consent state and I was legally allowed to record any conversation I was part of. The attorney confirmed that with a nod, and Anne sat back down. Ed banged a gavel and called for order, and he said the board would take a 10-minute recess to discuss the matter in executive session. Everyone filed out of the room except the board members and the attorney, and I stood in the hallway with my phone in my hand, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The couple from down the street had come to the meeting, and they walked over and said they were glad I had fought back. The wife said she had always thought Anne was too aggressive, and this proved it. I thanked them and waited. When the board called everyone back in, Ed looked tired. He said the board had reviewed the evidence and determined that the approval letter I had provided was valid, and the survey confirmed compliance with the setback requirements. He said the violation notice would be withdrawn and the fines would be waived. He also said the board would be conducting a review of the vendor coordinator role and the process for issuing violation notices to ensure compliance with the covenants and prevent future conflicts. He said the HOA attorney would be sending me a written retraction of the violation within 5 business days, and he apologized for the confusion. Anne sat with her arms crossed, staring at the table. Ed then said Anne would need to make a formal apology on the record, and he looked at her. She hesitated, and Ed said it was not optional. Anne stood up and said she apologized for any misunderstanding and she had acted in what she believed was the best interest of the association. Her voice was flat and she did not look at me. Ed said that was acceptable, and he moved to the next agenda item. The meeting ended 20 minutes later, and I walked out of that room feeling like I had just run a marathon. I went home and told my parent what had happened. They hugged me and said they were proud I had stood up for myself, and I felt a wave of relief. The next day, I got an email from the management company. They said they had reviewed the case and determined that Anne had exceeded her authority by issuing violation notices without board approval, and the board was freezing all enforcement actions pending a full policy rewrite to clarify the roles and responsibilities of board members. They said the attorney would be sending the written retraction by the end of the week, and they thanked me for bringing the matter to their attention. I forwarded the email to my attorney, and he said it was a good outcome and I should keep the documentation in case there were any future issues. The contractor came back the following Monday, and we started the fence. Anne did not show up. I saw her car drive past a few times, but she never stopped. The couple from down the street came over one afternoon and said they had heard through the neighborhood group chat that Anne had been removed from the vendor coordinator role and was no longer allowed to issue violation notices or interact with contractors without board oversight. They said there had been a lot of complaints about her over the years, and my case had finally given the board a reason to act. I thanked them for their support, and they said they were happy to help. The fence went up over the next 2 weeks, and it looked exactly like the photos I had submitted. My parents sat outside in the shade almost every day, and it was the first time in months I had seen them look relaxed. About a month later, I got a letter from the HOA attorney. It was a formal retraction of the violation notice, and it included a statement that the board had conducted a review of the enforcement process and implemented new policies to prevent similar issues in the future. The letter also said the board had received a complaint from me about Anne's conduct, and as a result, Anne had been subject to disciplinary action in accordance with the board's code of conduct. The letter did not specify what the discipline was, but I did not need to know. The important thing was that the complaint to the management company had triggered consequences, and the board had been forced to take action. I filed the letter with the rest of my documentation and moved on. I ran into Anne one more time about 6 weeks after the hearing. I was at the grocery store parking lot nearby, loading bags into my car when I saw her walking toward the entrance. She saw me and her face went tight, but she did not say anything. I nodded at her and kept loading my groceries. She walked past without a word, and I watched her go. I thought about everything that had happened, the stress, the threats, the hours of documentation and preparation. I thought about the moment at the hearing when I played the recording and her face went pale. I thought about the written retraction and the policy changes, and the fact that she could no longer weaponize the rules the way she had tried to do to me. And I realized that the best revenge was not some dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. It was just making sure the system worked the way it was supposed to, and holding people accountable when they abuse their power. The fence is still standing. My parent still sits outside almost every day. The HOA has not contacted me about any violations since the retraction, and the new enforcement policies seem to be working. I heard through the neighborhood group chat that Anne stepped down from the board entirely about 3 months after the hearing, and there was no drama about it. She just quietly resigned, and someone else took over her role. I do not know if she regrets what she did, and honestly, I do not care. I got my fence, I protected my parents' peace, and I made sure the next person who gets targeted by someone like her will have a better chance of fighting back. That is enough for me. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you being here.